Welcome to Sanity, a podcast by the New York Sun. My name is A.R. Hoffman, and every week my co-host Rebecca Sugar and I will try to make sense out of the nonsense and deliver a little bit of sanity to your week.
So the quote of the week was inspired by the Senate Republicans' digital ad that they put out this week. Did you see that?
I don't think so.
Oh,
I still haven't gotten over the Nayib Bukele quote last week. But okay.
I left an impression. That's wonderful. Well, you got to watch this because you're not
Okay.
going to get over this either. It's the best thing I saw all week. It was the Senate Republicans. They put out a digital ad. It was sort of a tourism ad for El Salvador. And it was rolling waves and sunny skies in El Salvador. And it sort of said, well, the voiceover was, "Welcome to El Salvador, the destination for Democrats seeking the thrill of bringing violent criminal aliens back to America." And it led me directly to the great Edgar Allan Poe, who said, "I do not suffer from insanity. I enjoy every minute of it."
That's great.
And it made me think, boy, were the Senate Republicans enjoying every minute of this
I'm
week.
sure. I mean, we'll get to that later, but the controversy over Margarita Gate was just phenomenal. And like, was that salt on the rim of the glass?
Yes, there's so much here.
Right.
We could do a whole show just on this.
Right. Okay, well, we might get to margaritas. Unfortunately, we don't have any with us right now.
And this is our 10th show. I think we should have margaritas, shouldn't we?
Cheers to that.
All right, next time.
We'll start off talking about the big news of the week, the top story of the week, and that's the passing of the Pope, the funerals Saturday, and conclave to follow soon after that. So we'll put on our best kind of Vaticanologists hats and maybe get some predictions. Our Make It Make Sense section this week will be the Supreme Court case of Mahmood v. Taylor. That's the case that revolves around LGBT themed books and parental rights and religious liberties and all that good stuff that was argued Supreme Court this week. Next, tipping point, we'll go to the Russia-Ukraine war, where just moments ago, Trump tweeted out, "Vladimir, stop it." And we'll see if, how realistic that is. And we'll close out the show with our sunburns.
Right. And we want to remind everybody that they should
right.
be...
I was supposed to say that. We'll be releasing an interview with the very popular actor Nate Buzalich. We'll talk to him about politics and showbiz and his personal convictions, and I think you'll really enjoy it.
Great. Okay, so we're going to start with the top story, which is the death of Pope Francis on Easter Monday. He was 88 years old. He served for 12 years, I believe, as Pope. He was widely seen as a more progressive Pope in the sense that he advocated for positions both external to the church, I'd say, and internal to the church that were seen as breaking with, traditional Catholic sort of dogma. On the political level, he was very outspoken about immigration, criticized the Trump administration, Trump Admin 1, on its building of a wall at the southern border, of course, while he was resident at the Vatican, which is walled off. So there was criticism of him for that. He gave communion to Nancy Pelosi at the time, even though she was an advocate of abortion rights, and he was criticized
An issue that
for
came
that.
up with Joe Biden, too.
Right, correct. And of
John
course,
Kerry.
his stance on the blessing of gay unions was controversial. So in a lot of ways, he was dealing with political issues around the world and in America, of course, that were hot button topics and had a very non-Catholic, non-traditional Catholic view of them.
Yeah. Some of his final moments were spent with Vice President J.D. Vance.
God has a sense of humor, right?
I don't think that's a Catholic phrase, maybe a Jewish one, right? Man plans and God laughs. Right?
What I found, all of it's sort of interesting, but what I found most interesting actually was reading some of the Christian responses to his death and to his tenure as Pope. And I found this really extraordinary article in First Things, the First Things Journal, and I just wanted to read one sentence from it, which I thought was really interesting. It's by George Weigel, excuse me if I'm not pronouncing it correctly. He wrote, "Christian communities whose self-identity becomes incoherent, whose boundaries become porous, and who mirror the culture rather than trying to convert it, wither and die." He's obviously criticizing the progressive posture of this Pope. He pushed back against traditional Latin masses. He did a lot of things internally within the Catholic Church that more traditionalist Catholics really didn't agree with. And so this idea that he didn't take the Catholic Church and use it to lead culture, but rather responded to the culture, I thought was really interesting and maybe a valid critique, although I'm not Catholic, so I'm not trying to get a dog in the fight. I just think it's an interesting idea, and I think it could be said of a lot of other leaders and other domains in American life. And maybe the West. So that I found that very interesting.
Yeah, very well said. And George Weigel is the biographer of John Paul II, right? And a very kind of eminent Catholic journalist and writer. And in the kind of pendulum swing, John Paul is seen as a man of great charisma and of conservative belief. And Benedict maybe was a man of little charisma, but even stronger conservative belief. And then Francis, at least when he was well, a decade ago, was a person of great charisma, but commitments on the left. Those had to do with his upbringing in Argentina. They're generational. The kind of cohort of priests who came of age during Vatican II, that kind of 60s moment of great promise.
He was also a bouncer, I learned, at a nightclub.
He was a bouncer. If you see those early pictures of him, he's a cool dude.
Yeah.
You see him sitting on the bus in Buenos Aires, and you wouldn't want to cross him. Pun intended. But I think that's absolutely right. I think that why conclaves, why the passing of the Pope is so interesting is because it's about personalities, but it's also about ideology, and it's about direction. I mean, the two great, I think, kind of pre-modern, mysterious, magical institutions left in the world are the papacy at Rome and the monarchy in England, right? And the monarchy has its own drama, but it's hereditary. There's no choice, right? The choice wasn't between, Charles and Andrew or whatever.
What a choice!
What a choice! Heads you lose, tails I win. But with the church, there is a choice. There is an election of sorts, and you're absolutely right to say, which way will it go? On the one hand, Francis appointed 80% of the cardinals who will vote in the next. Who will vote for the next pope? Right. On the other hand, and we might get to this a little bit. The church is changing. Its sources of strength, demographic strength now, are Africa, and Latin America, and to a certain extent Asia.
Right.
And those are more conservative cultures, where views on issues like sexuality and gender roles are closer to, let's say the American right, roughly speaking. And so you have these dynamics going on where on the one hand you have a changing church, but maybe not necessarily in a leftward direction.
Right. And one of the top contenders is an African cardinal who is conservative on these very issues.
Cardinal Robert Serra.
Right.
Robert Serra Cardinal. And I still think it's a long shot. I wrote a piece on this about, the church's African future. And I still think it's a long shot. But, if you were sort of betting in 30, 40, 50 years, you'd say, there will be an African pope, just in terms of, as demographics decline in Europe generally, and then among Catholics in particular.
Yeah, I read your piece, which I thought was great and everyone should look at. And I sort of read into it in my own way, sort of shades of DEI, even though I don't think that was what you necessarily intended to say. But this parsing out, you meant it more from what you just said, a demographic point of view and the seat of power and the sort of wave of the future for the Catholic faith. But there is this sort of consideration of excitement around the idea of the first African pope and a man with black skin being a pope. And it's interesting, too, that maybe like we should check with George Weigel and what he would say about that. Is that the culture pushing into the papacy, or should the papacy be disregarding those issues and leading the way, regardless of the DEI implications or the seat of power? Who would the best pope be?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing is that the Catholic Church, and the word Catholic means universal, and so its claim has always been that it's global, right? So, to what extent should its upper echelon reflect that reality? This is a broader issue about demographics. That as Europe and America age, Africa is an extraordinarily young continent. How will that change sort of power dynamics on a global scale in the next in future decades? The DEI question is sort of an interesting one because when popes are considered or possible popes are considered, geography is a consideration, nationality. And
as it was with Francis.
Of course. And so the thinking is, Francis was the first Latin American pope. Is there further appetite for more geographic diversity? Or do we get the kind of, a reversion to the mean, kind of an old Italian guy?
Yeah, an old Italian guy. And just to say, lastly, because you brought up J.D. Vance, I think it is important to note that he, and to a degree President Trump, but, he's a Catholic, a convert to Catholic later in life, and he described Pope Francis, with whom he probably disagreed on most political issues, as a man who exemplified Christian charity and care for the poor and the disaffected, regardless of his politics, which I would say sometimes went off the rails. He was a man who cared about poor people, migrants, people who needed help, which is what we would imagine the Catholic Church would care about. He wasn't a big fan of Israel and the Jews. He wasn't. There were a lot of people he didn't look so favorably on.
I think that was less kind of animist in just his overall sort of worldview. I don't think it was at all prejudiced. But he had a sympathy, a sharp sympathy for the Palestinians. I mean, to kind of give him some credit, to go back to when he was first ascended to the papacy, the church was in a tough spot. Benedict had resigned, first time in, I think, I don't know, millennia. I could be wrong. I knew the number, but where you had a resignation. The church was still crippled by sexual abuse scandal that really bloomed under John Paul II, and Benedict couldn't really get a handle on. And of course, Francis was not perfect on that score either in terms of on an administrative level. So, the church needed a breath of fresh air, I think. And I think in those early days, he did, there was a change of tone and a change, famously, who am I to judge? And even if I think there was a lot of good. Yeah.
Listen, I just want to also say, before I forget to say it, that, if we're tilting towards Africa here, I think it's worth reminding everybody that Christians have been being killed in Africa for decades now, and nobody's done much of anything about it, at least of all the Catholic Church. So that would be a moment also for the church to address the elephant in the room in that case.
Yeah, and Benedict famously gave a speech about Islam and was really criticized for it. And in researching that piece on the church in Africa, I think I didn't get to put enough of this in the piece, is that what interested me more than what these African cardinals have to say about gay marriage or gender issues actually was what they have to say about Islam. And almost all of them have, made comments, it's a pressing issue, I guess is what I'm saying for them, and a life or death issue. And, how that plays out.
It'd be nice to see them do something about it rather than talk about it.
We'll see. But, but just to say, that is something that's top of mind for these people in a way that it's not for a German cardinal, or maybe it should be. But
okay, all right, we'll call this segment like two Jews talking about the Pope.
Jews-splaining the Pope.
Jews-splaining the Catholic Church. Okay. Make it make sense. Let's make something make sense now. This case in Maryland. Do you want to give a quick legal overview of what this is about?
Sure. I think it's a fairly straightforward case, and that is some families or parents sued to kind of be able to have an opt-out for their kids for being exposed to. There's a little bit of debate about exactly what it looks like, but books whose content they find religiously objectionable or culturally objectionable or whatever, and those parents lost down below, but I listened to some of the oral arguments. They were almost 3 hours, But this is a court that's really pretty vigilant on religious liberty issues. I mean, if you had to say, is there one set of constitutional issues that this court has really distinguished itself, I think religious liberty is the place. So I think, I wouldn't necessarily put money in who I think is going to be the next pope, but I would put money on the fact that the court is going to come down on the side of these parents.
Yeah, it's sounding like it from the oral arguments. I think, look, there are a few different issues, it feels like, happening at the same time here. One is just the age of the children. This is starting in pre-K. And this was an opt-out option that pre-existed that the board in Montgomery County nixed. And so it was there before. It's there for other classes and other grade levels. So why this and why
strange,
pre-K? And the books are part of the English curriculum. And so it's not really obvious why those books on identifying the transgender student, or there's one book about finding a gender neutral bathroom in your school. Why would that be appropriate regardless of your religious beliefs for any 12-year-old, 10-year-old, 6-year-old? So there's the age issue. There's also I think the oral arguments talked a lot about coercion, versus exposure, right? Is this an issue of just exposing kids to ideas, in which case what's the big deal? Or are you sort of coercing them by pushing an agenda? And there's a debate back and forth about it. It feels to me like when you're talking about 6-year-olds and when you're talking about 16-year-olds.
Is that a distinction that makes a difference? I mean, if you teach a 6-year-old, if they're reading something, it doesn't seem like their minds are finely tuned enough to be able to say, oh, this is not what the teacher thinks this is
right. They can't say,
they can't make that
there
distinction.
is another way to look at this.
Right.
They're only accepting what the teacher is putting in front of them, and so there's some version of coercion that exists there, and maybe coercion for the parents. Maybe they're part of that calculation.
I don't know. I mean, I wonder, I mean, as a parent, I mean, did you have the option, or did you review the sort of syllabus of books that your kids read in school?
No, but my kids are 18, so some of this, it feels, in the last decade, and by then they were, sort of, they had the mindset to think about these things, and we talk about these things a lot at home anyway, so I feel they're inoculated against the crazy. I also send them to a parochial school, a Jewish day school. So to some degree, but not entirely, we're insulated from some of this stuff too. But I'm a big believer that we should be teaching our children these things in our own homes. And that leads me to this other point that I picked up from this. Like, I hear the religious liberty argument. I know that's the argument being debated here in this Supreme Court case, but I think this is also a parental rights issue. And I think it was Jonathan Turley who sort of said yesterday on the news, he really hopes that this is decided as a parental rights issue and not just a religious rights issue, because there's something really deeply disturbing, especially when we talk about these younger ages, about my right as a parent to have say over the kinds of things that you're teaching my child that really aren't relevant to the topic that they say they're teaching in class. In an English class, I'm not sure why these topics are relevant. And so that's more than religious. There are a lot of non-religious people who would find that very objectionable.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And, but I also think that, when you mount a case like this and you get to the Supreme Court, there's a lot of strategy that goes into it. And I think the challengers to this policy knew that a religious liberty argument would land well. And so even in the description of the plaintiffs, you have, it's a kind of perfect medley of, Russian Orthodox and, Catholic and Muslim. I mean, the case is Mahmood v. Taylor. And I think, there's a kind of strategic reason for that.
And what do you think the other side could possibly be thinking? Is this just another, sort of left 80-20 losing issue that they can't help themselves but fight for? Or is this such a strong ideological need to control children in schools? What could be animating the need to take it to the Supreme Court? This couldn't have been worked out with parents?
Yeah, I mean, certainly the school district got beat up in oral arguments. So that suggests to me that, they hadn't, crossed all their T's and dotted all their I's. I think their best argument probably, and this is not a great argument, is a slippery slope argument, right? Is like, well, if we allow opt-outs for this, can someone opt out of everything, right? And maybe there's a sort of interesting question there. That goes to kind of the parental rights question. How much say does a parent have over the curriculum of their child?
Although they have opt-outs in other grades in that
Yeah.
same school.
And that's the kind of argument that does well at the court, when you can say, hey, there's this general policy, this is the deviation,
Right.
what gives?
Right.
Then it starts to look like a targeted and to your point, an almost ideological insistence.
That's the worry, right? And look at, if this is an ideological push, which it seems to me it is, look at the lengths to which they're willing to go to achieve their goals, which I think should, make the hairs on every parent's neck stand up.
Yeah. I mean, I thought one sort of interesting question that came up during oral arguments was, well, what if the book's in the room? And that goes to this question of education, ambiance, exposure. How do you modulate those things? And I think the parents took, I think, I could be wrong, a fairly common sense position that, like, this, we're talking about reading. Yeah. Right. It has to be a more active kind of thing.
Right. They weren't asking for anything to be taken out of the room.
Exactly. Right. And not to make this all about gamesmanship, but again, a really strong position when you're arguing at the Supreme Court is to say, I'm not asking for the moon. Yeah. Right. I'm actually making a reasonable request.
Although I have to say, as a parent, that would still bother me because we all understand why it's even in the room. There's no book slipped in the room about conservative Christian marriage, and they just happen to be using it to talk about, to teach kids how to read. Yeah. So there is an agenda, obviously, and so even if it's not explicit and pushed in my kid's face, I would feel uncomfortable in a school where that is the thing they keep trying to put in wherever they can get it. Yeah. And I think parents smell that, and Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson said, picked up on sort of that argument and said, well, the parents can just go to a different school if they don't like what's being taught in the school, except, they probably can't.
Well, that's never a great argument.
Terrible argument. There's something about knowing that the people who have your kids in a room for 8 hours a day have an agenda, and if they can't get it in directly, they'll get it in sideways, is still a problem.
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of interesting how this specter of kind of banning books has a kind of hold on the imagination, and like you said, a library is always a choice, what's in and what's out, especially like a school library where it feels like there's usually a librarian or a teacher and everything is kind of bespoke. Yeah. I'm just trying to imagine, I mean, what if parents said, we don't want our kids reading Catcher in the Rye, let's say, or, at what point would those demands start, to be unreasonable, or let's say, teaching at a university and I'm teaching, Mr. Samore's Planet by Saul Bellow, which has, material that some people find objectionable, racial material of its time. Would I be comfortable with students opting out from that?
Look, I think there's so many ways to think about it, right? It's also back to age. These questions are just different questions at different ages, and it's not a clear line when that age is or isn't. But there's some understanding of it that we all have, and this is a clear breach of that line, it seems to me. But you're right to say there are lots of questions that this brings up, and you don't want to set the wrong precedent. But I'm not sure that this case is a slippery slope in my mind. This case seems much more about parental rights and the right to shield children from an agenda that is sweeping the country and that is just age inappropriate. Let's just say that, if nothing else.
Yeah. And we'll move on. We could talk about this all day. I mean, the idea of opt-out is a fairly well-used technique in religious liberty, right? I mean, that's, I don't feel comfortable. Doing this violates my religious beliefs. Okay, you don't have to do that. That's a technique that the court has used before, right? And is usually seen as a way to balance the rights, the religious liberty rights of the individual versus, whatever competing claims or whatever.
And they're not, opt-outs are not that hard for schools. And one of the arguments here was that this puts an undue burden on the school. It just doesn't. It's not true. And I remember during after the Parkland shootings, and there were the walkouts, the school walkouts. I objected to the walkouts because they were in favor of legislative action on Second Amendment rights, and I believe in the Second Amendment. So my kids were young enough then where I sort of said to them, "You're opting out of the walkouts. You're just not allowed to leave the classroom," and they opted out, and most of their friends left because they wanted the time off.
Yeah, of course.
My poor kids had to sit inside a stuffy classroom, and but it was fine. Yeah, they opted out, and that was that.
Yeah.
Okay. Vlad, stop it.
Vladimir, stop it.
Tipping point.
This is a story we've tracked, and it seems clear. What Trump's kind of vision, let's say, has sort of come into focus. We're talking here, of course, about the Russia-Ukraine war. I mean, he basically wants the war done and is willing to sort of, if you had to say, what side is he kind of willing to put some weight on to get that done? I think it's on a pro-Russia side, broadly speaking. And J.D. Vance made comments to those effects the other day. I don't think it's due to any sort of great love for Russia. I think he sees that as the fastest way. But that hasn't really been happening. And the war is not stopping. And, wars have a funny way of not stopping or taking their own course.
You don't think Vladimir is going to stop?
No, I don't. And I don't know, I don't know if pressure is being applied behind the scenes or what the broader strategy is. The sort of danger here a little bit for Ukraine, at least, is that, is America walking away, okay, well, what happens then?
That's really the big question, because America's walking away.
Yeah.
I've been very non-sympathetic. I would say most people would have heard me talk about Zelensky and Ukraine, and I haven't sounded enormously sympathetic, although I'm hugely sympathetic to the Ukrainian people and what's happened to them. But the 7-point plan that Trump put forward for a peace plan, I would say I had some sympathy for Zelensky. It did read like a lot of concessions to Russia, or at least things that would make Russia happier than not. But at the same time, I read it and I thought it is sort of, harshly realistic. Right. The things that have to be conceded. I mean, Crimea, that was Zelensky's sort of red line. Absolutely, I will not sign anything that allows the United States to recognize Crimea as Russian territory. It didn't even require Zelensky to do so, actually. But of course, for him, that's a red line. But to be honest, he's not getting the Crimea back. He didn't, and as Donald Trump pointed out,
that die was cast a decade ago.
Yeah, he didn't fight for it in 2014. Donald Trump pointed out. So okay, it's sometimes reality is brutal, but that is still the reality. And the 4 sort of areas in the southeastern part of the Ukraine that Russia would have control over, again, not really. Fair that they would get it if we're talking about fairness, but we're not. We're talking about reality. And Trump is looking at the map and saying, here's the brutal reality, Zelensky. You didn't lose the war, but you didn't win. And it's got to end. And so he...
Yeah, the problem is if you're Putin, you're kind of like, okay, I've already banked those. This is where my line of scrimmage is. And I can just take more.
This is a good deal for him, I would say. Generally, he's not getting everything he wants, but even the things he said he wanted, those were just negotiating tactics. Disarming all of Ukraine, he was never going to get that. And
I think that broadly speaking, one of the things kind of Trump has to worry a little bit about here, is the 2 big sort of negotiations right now are the Iran negotiations and the Russia-Ukraine negotiations. And I don't really feel like America has a handle on either. And, we'll see. We'll see what'll happen.
I get the sense that I'm hoping that there's more going on behind the scenes with the Iranian negotiations that we don't know about than I think are going on here. I actually think he's just going to walk away if they don't accept the terms. And then nobody knows what will happen, really. And they can't sustain this war, the Ukrainians, without American intelligence, American support. I don't know what's going to happen, but I would have thought Zelensky would have come to the table. He sort of did, but he didn't.
I mean, the problem
he came to the table for a 30-day ceasefire.
But how do you get Putin to the table? I mean, that's the stop it, Vlad.
Yeah, that's the stop it, Vlad. Let's see. I don't know. I guess I'm with you on the concern that there might not be a plan B here, but I'm sort of still the jury's out on the Iranian situation if there's a plan B there.
Yeah. I think Witkoff's in over his head. I on the other hand, we talked a little bit about this last week. I mean, is this a sort of you negotiate and then it doesn't work and then you move on to a more kinetic phase, or
regarding Iran?
Regarding Iran, or is there?
Listen, he's got oil prices to worry about right now.
Mm-hmm.
Donald Trump does, and so he can't start a war right now.
No.
He can't start a war anyway because his base didn't elect him to do that.
Yeah.
They elected him to end wars.
Yeah.
And he has a shaky economy, and he's underwater, and the poll numbers on the economy, and he doesn't want an oil price to soar. Mm-hmm. So I don't know. I just have to assume there's something else happening with Iran. Maybe I'm just wishful thinking.
We'll see. Okay.
All right. Sunburn time?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, mine is the World Economic Forum. Just when you think they couldn't have picked anybody more ridiculous than Klaus Schwab, who recently resigned and is now being investigated for all kinds of corruption. They do. They go straight to central casting, and they picked somebody whose name I'm going to botch, but he's the former Nestle CEO, Peter Brabeck-Letmath. Doesn't matter what his name is. He's Klaus Schwab in different clothing. He's the interim chairman. There's a video going around. I don't know if you've seen him. He sort of does have that scary kind of deep state, spooky globalist look about him, but he talks about
throwing a globalist. I love it. Like Davos man.
It's like from the Batman movie. Mm-hmm. And he basically is talking about limits on water usage and that water's not a human right. And he suggests that everybody just use 50 to 100 liters of water per day, and no swimming pools and no car washes, of course. And, you can just imagine him going home to his, 90-foot swimming pool. Yeah. But, Klaus Schwab was, you'll have nothing and be happy. And this guy is, you'll wash nothing and be happy. And I just, hope that I don't know who wakes up and realizes that these globalist entities, these bodies, anything that's an acronym that says world in it, we should be wary of and distance ourselves from and not take their advice. As Klaus Schwab has now proven decisively, everything they tell us to do, they don't do themselves. Mm.
I totally agree. Although if invited to Davos, I'd go once. I hear it's beautiful. I feel like I'm almost taking this segment and sort of making it into like a recommendation one. But I'd like to recommend that people who are here in New York go see the new Frick. I just went this week, and it's amazing.
I haven't been.
Really wonderful, and just a great story, right? It was built in 1914. It was a house and a collection, and they spent over $300 million in about 5 years. And it's gorgeous.
Maybe they should Doge that.
Yeah,
sounds like a lot of money.
In my review, is coming out. I said it was a bargain, but maybe
you'll never get a job with Elon Musk.
Yeah, no. Go on a sunny day, walk in Central Park, see the Vermeers, and
this is not a sunburn. I object.
It's a sunny day. It's a sunny day. So
okay, next week I expect to see anger and steam
I was
coming out of your ears.
And I was gonna say one of the most lovely things about the decoration are the sunlights, which have been cleaned and restored.
Maybe Boris will put some harp music in the background for this part of the segment, and we can all sing, lock arms.
Anyway.
Okay, Frick, with that.
Get there. Okay.
Good to see you.
Always. Bye.